If you drive along Highway 24 in Levy County, Florida today, there is nothing to tell you what you are passing through. The land is flat and scrubby in the way of the Florida interior. Not the beaches and palm trees of the postcards, but the older, quieter Florida. The one that runs inland from the coasts and goes on longer than you expect. Pine trees and palmetto, and the particular pale light that falls on open ground in January. A county road turns off the highway and runs through what might once have been something. The grass grows in a certain way. The trees press close to the road in a certain way. That is all. For more than 60 years, that was all that remained of Rosewood. A town of 200 people was destroyed in the first week of January 1923. Not by hurricane, not by flood, by a mob of white men who came from the surrounding counties with guns and torches and a purpose, and who spent 7 days reducing everything that had been built there to ash. Every house, every church, the schoolhouse, the turpentine distillery, the freight depot on the Seaboard Airline Railway. Every structure that stood was burned or pulled down until there was nothing left to show that people had lived there and worked there and raised their children there and buried their dead there. No one was charged with any crime. Not one person faced legal consequence of any kind for what was done in those 7 days. The Florida state government conducted no investigation. The federal government did not intervene. The newspapers in the surrounding counties characterized it as a race riot and moved on to other stories. And Rosewood disappeared from the map. Not from memory, the people who had lived there carried it with them every day for the rest of their lives, but from the official record of what existed, of what had happened, of what Florida had permitted, and what Florida had failed to stop. The name was erased from the county register. The land was sold or absorbed by neighboring properties at prices that bore no relationship to what had been taken. The road sign came down. For 60 years, if you drove along that highway, there was nothing to tell you what you were passing through. This is a story about what it means to erase a place, about the particular violence of making something disappear, not just the buildings, not just the people, but the fact of the thing itself. About what the people who survived carried in the decades that followed and how they carried it and what it cost them and what it finally took to bring it into the light. Rosewood in 1922 was not a poor town. That matters, and I want to say it plainly because the story of Rosewood is sometimes told as if the poverty of its residents explains or at least contextualizes what was done to them. It does not. Rosewood was a self-sufficient community, a whistle stop on the Seaboard Airline Railway, a place with its own internal economy and its own institutions. The residents owned land. They owned their homes. They had a Baptist church and a Methodist church and a school. They worked in the turpentine distillery and at the nearby Cummer Lumber Company mill, and some of them had built independent trades. Sylvester Carrier was one of those. He was a craftsman, a blacksmith known in the area for his skill. He was also the music teacher for the children of Rosewood. He played piano and taught the children in the community, and the detail sits with you when you learn it as a specific and intimate thing that gets burned along with everything else. Not just the building, the music lessons, the particular knowledge of a particular man who was good at a particular thing, passed on to children who would now have to carry it somewhere else. Rosewood was mostly black, with one white family, John Wright and his family, who ran the general store. Wright knew his neighbors. He had done business with them for years. That knowledge would matter later in the ways that knowing your neighbors sometimes matters when everything else has broken down. Sumner was the white town a few miles to the west, where most of the county's white families lived. Sumner was smaller than Rosewood. Sumner was poorer than Rosewood. In 1922, in the Florida interior, in a county still organized largely by the hierarchies of the post-Reconstruction South, that comparison carried a specific charge. New Year's Day, 1923, broke cold and clear over Levy County. In Sumner, a 22-year-old woman named Fannie Taylor was home alone, while her husband James, a foreman at the mill, was at work. At some point in the late morning, a neighbor heard screaming from the Taylor house. She found Fannie Taylor inside, bruised and shaken, saying that a black man had entered the house and attacked her. The neighbor called for help. James Taylor was summoned from the mill. The story spread through Sumner with the speed that stories spread in small towns when the conditions are right for them to spread fast, each retelling adding weight and urgency until by the time the afternoon was over, what had begun as a woman's account of an assault had become, in the mouth of the community, something larger and more inflammatory than what Fannie Taylor herself had described. Fannie Taylor said clearly that she had not been raped. This detail was noted at the time and then set aside. What several people in the community said quietly to each other and not to the authorities was something different. A white man, possibly a man that Fannie Taylor had been seeing outside her marriage, had been observed leaving the Taylor house that morning. He had been seen by more than one person. Nobody said this publicly. Nobody said it to the sheriff. The community, in the way of communities that understand what is about to happen, sealed the alternative explanation away in the place where inconvenient truths go. Sheriff Robert Walker assembled a posse to search for a black man named Jesse Hunter, an escaped convict from a road gang who was said to be in the area. There was no evidence that Hunter had been anywhere near the Taylor house. There was no evidence that Hunter had anything to do with what had happened to Fannie Taylor. His name was invoked because a name was needed, because the thing that was building in Sumner needed something to attach itself to, and Hunter's name was available. The posse fanned out toward Rosewood. What happened in the following 7 days did not unfold all at once. It built. On the afternoon of January 1st, the mob found Sam Carter, a black craftsman from Rosewood. They believed he had helped Hunter escape or had information about him. They took Carter from the road where they found him. They tortured him for information about a man whose presence in the area they had no evidence of. Then they hanged him from a tree. His body was left there. In Rosewood, people heard what had happened to Sam Carter and understood what it meant. The men armed themselves. The women began preparing to move. There was no illusion among the people of Rosewood that the sheriff's posse was interested in locating a particular escaped convict. What was coming toward them was not an investigation. It was something older and more total than that. For 3 days, the mob moved through the edges of Rosewood, searching houses, demanding information, terrorizing families. The sheriff was present for some of this. He did not stop it. He managed it in the way that white Southern law enforcement sometimes managed these events, preventing the very worst outcomes when he could, absorbing the rest as the cost of keeping order, which in Levy County in 1923 meant keeping the peace as the white community defined it. On the night of January 4th, a group of men approached the house of Sylvester Carrier, where a number of Rosewood residents had gathered. The men on the porch believed there were people inside the house who had information about Hunter. Sylvester Carrier and the others inside the house believed the men on the porch had come to kill them. A gunfight broke out. Sylvester Carrier was a good shot. 2 white men were killed and several others wounded before the mob fell back. A black community in Florida had shot and killed white men in defense of their home. The mob that regrouped was not the same mob that had arrived at the Carrier house. Word had gone out across the county and beyond by telephone, by automobile, by the particular transmission system of white rural Florida in 1923, which moved efficiently when it needed to. Men came from neighboring counties. A group of Ku Klux Klan members who happened to be gathered in Gainesville for a rally were among those who heard the call. By some estimates, the crowd that descended on Rosewood on January 5th numbered between 200 and 300 men. They came with guns and with fire. They moved through Rosewood building by building, the church, the school, the homes along the main road. Whatever was not already burning was set alight. People who could not get out in time, the elderly, the very young, those who had nowhere to go, faced what they faced. The specific accounting of who was killed and how many has never been fully established. The official figure at the time was 8, dead 6, black 2 white. Eyewitness accounts and the testimony of survivors gathered decades later suggest the real number was much higher. Some estimates place it at 30 or more. The truth is that we do not know because the people who burned Rosewood did not keep records and the state of Florida did not commission an inquiry. What is not in dispute is what was left on January 7th when the fires went out. Nothing. Every building in Rosewood was gone. Every home that had held a family was ash. John Wright, the white storekeeper, had opened his house on the night of January 4th. He had taken in women and children, neighbors, people he knew, and hidden them while the violence moved through the town. He called in a favor with the train conductor, a man named Bryce, and arranged for the Seaboard airline train to slow its scheduled run through the area long enough to take on passengers. On the night of January 4th and into January 5th, the women and children of Rosewood climbed aboard that train. They did not bring much with them. There was not time, and there was not safety in moving across open ground carrying possessions. They left with what they could carry in their hands. The men could not board. The mob was watching the rail line. A man moving through that corridor in those hours was a man who could be shot. The men who had fought back from the Carrier house and the other men of Rosewood went into the woods and the swamp. They stayed there. Minnie Lee Langley was 9 years old. She was among the children hidden in Wright's house and then put onto the train. She remembered for the rest of her long life the cold of those nights, the Florida January, which is not tropical warmth, but a damp chill that gets into the bones of a child crouched in the dark, waiting for something to stop. She remembered waiting 3 days and 3 nights in the woods before the train came. She remembered the sound of the fires. We stayed out there 3 days and 3 nights out there in the woods. She said 70 years later before the Florida legislature. It hurt me. She was 82 years old when she said it. She had not spoken publicly about Rosewood in the 71 years between that January and that hearing. Not publicly, not to anyone outside her family. The people of Rosewood settled in Gainesville, in Jacksonville, in cities in the north. They dispersed in the way that people disperse when they have been made to understand that the place they came from no longer exists, that going back is not possible, that the ground where they stood is now claimed by other people who have the power to keep it. They did not talk about what had happened. This silence. The silence of the Rosewood survivors is different from the silences in other stories of injustice and community. It was not the silence of people who felt guilty or who were protecting something they had done. It was the silence of people who had learned in the most direct way possible what speaking cost. The men who had burned their town were still alive. Many of them still lived in Levy County. Their names were known. The surviving families of Rosewood knew those names and knew that those men had never faced any consequence and knew that if a survivor stood up and said what had happened, the consequence would fall not on the mob but on the person doing the speaking. Arnett Doctor was a boy in the late 1940s when he first heard about Rosewood. He was the great-grandson of Sarah Carrier, who had been killed in her own house on the night of January 4th. His family knew what had happened. They had always known, but the knowledge was held under a particular set of rules. It could only be discussed within the family at the discretion of the elders in private, not in public, not with outsiders. It was fear and protection, he said years later. That mob that ravaged Rosewood, as they did many of those people, were still alive, and my mother was aware of them by name. His mother forbade him to speak about Rosewood while she was alive. He followed that instruction. For decades. He was a grown man with children of his own before he began to do anything with what he had been carrying since childhood. This is a specific kind of burden, the knowledge of a terrible thing that you are not permitted to name publicly, that you must carry in private, for the sake of safety, that you must pass to your children with the instruction to also keep it private for the same reason. The burden compounds across generations. Each generation inherits not only the knowledge, but the silence and the understanding of why the silence is necessary, and the grief of a thing that cannot be mourned publicly, because mourning it publicly is dangerous. Minnie Lee Langley lived to 82 with that grief. Wilson Hall lived with it. Arnett Turner Goins lived with it. The last known survivor of the Rosewood Massacre, a woman named Mary Hall Daniels, died in May 2018 at the age of 102. She had been 7 years old in January 1923. For most of her life, the state of Florida had not acknowledged that what happened to her had happened. In 1982, a journalist named Gary Moore, writing for the St. Petersburg Times, published the first modern account of the Rosewood Massacre. Moore had heard about Rosewood through a chain of sources that led him eventually to the survivors and descendants who were still alive and still carrying the story. He spent time with them. He listened. He wrote about what they told him about the week in January 1923, about the mob, about the train, about what they had left behind and never recovered. The series of articles ran in the summer of 1982. The following year, 60 Minutes aired a segment based in part on Moore's reporting. For the first time, the story of Rosewood reached a national audience. For the first time, people who had no connection to Levy County, Florida, heard the name of the town that had been erased. Arnett Doctor read the articles. His mother had died. He was no longer bound by the instruction she had given him, and the instruction he decided had served its purpose. The people who had made the silence necessary were mostly dead. What was now needed was the opposite of silence. He began gathering evidence. Not just the family stories, though. He had those carefully preserved, but the documentary record, land deeds, property records, tax assessments, birth and death certificates, census data. The paper trail of a community that had owned things, built things, paid taxes, been counted, and then been erased. He connected with a law firm in Tallahassee, Holland, and Knight, whose attorneys agreed to take the case without payment. He found the other survivors. He found their children and grandchildren. He began the long process of convincing the Florida legislature that something had happened in Levy County in 1923 that the state of Florida was obligated to address. In December 1993, a team of researchers led by Dr. Maxine Jones submitted a formal documented history of the Rosewood Massacre to the Florida Board of Regents, the first official acknowledgement by any Florida state institution that Rosewood had existed and that it had been destroyed. In the spring of 1994, the survivors came to Tallahassee. Minnie Lee Langley was 82 years old when she sat before the Florida House Judiciary Committee and described what she had seen and heard and felt as a 9-year-old child in the first week of January 1923. She described the cold of the swamp. She described the sound of the houses burning. She described seeing the men who had fought back from the Carrier House, the bodies of the 2 white attackers laid out on the floor. She described the train. Wilson Hall described watching from the 2nd floor of his family's house, the flames rising from the homes of his neighbors before his own family had to run. Arnett Turner Goins, who had been inside the Carrier House that night, described the night of January 4th. They were old people. They had been carrying this for 71 years, and they sat in a government building in the state that had failed to protect them and that had spent 7 decades pretending it had not happened, and they told the truth. The Florida legislature passed the Rosewood Claims Bill on April 8, 1994. It allocated $2,100,000 to the survivors and descendants of the Rosewood Massacre, $150,000 to each of the 9 living survivors, with smaller amounts to descendant families. It established a scholarship fund for Rosewood descendants to attend Florida state universities. The bill also included a finding of formal legislative determination that local and federal officials had in January 1923 sufficient time and opportunity to act to prevent the tragedy, but had failed to act. It was the first time a legislative body in the United States had paid reparations to black people for a racial massacre. The bill noted this: the men and women who passed it seemed to understand that they were doing something that had not been done before. The 9 living survivors received their checks. Minnie Lee Langley received hers. She died in December 1995, a year after the bill passed. She was 83 years old. She had lived 60 years in silence and 1 year in acknowledgement. There is a historical marker at the site of Rosewood now. It went up in the years following the 1994 bill placed by the state of Florida as part of the formal recognition of what had happened there. If you know to look for it, you can find it. If you are driving through on Highway 24 without knowing, to look you might still miss it. The landscape does not announce itself. The ground does not hold the shape of what was once there. The marker tells you the name. It tells you the dates. It tells you what happened. In summary, the attack, the burning, the flight of the survivors. It is small and factual, and it stands at the edge of a piece of ground where no buildings remain, where nothing of what was built there in the 1920s survives above the soil. I think about what it takes for a place to come back from erasure. Not the physical structures, those are gone and will not return, but the acknowledgement of the name. The marker that says, here, there was something, and it was destroyed, and the destruction was wrong. That acknowledgement is not nothing. It arrived 71 years late in the form of a check and a marker and a scholarship fund, and it arrived too late for most of the people who needed it. Minnie Lee Langley lived 60 years waiting for it and 1 year with it. But I also think about what the silence cost the decades of carrying something in private that should have been named in public, the generational transmission of grief that could not be grieved openly, the instruction that Arnett Doctor received from his mother, and that I suspect she received from someone before her, do not speak of this, where it can reach the wrong ears. That instruction was wise. It kept people alive, or at least safer than they would otherwise have been. The people of Levy County who burned Rosewood were still present, still local, still capable of harm. The silence was a form of protection, but it was also a form of ongoing violence, the continuation by other means of what the mob had begun. The mob had erased the place. The necessity of silence erased the story. Each generation that grew up without being able to say Rosewood's name in public was a generation that had something taken from it by the same event 60 years on. Arnett Doctor broke the silence. He did it carefully, methodically, with land deeds and legal representation and the testimony of elderly survivors who had waited most of their lives to be heard. He did it after his mother died and gave him permission by her absence. He did it, and the state of Florida responded eventually with $2 million and a marker and a scholarship fund and a formal acknowledgement of failure. He died in 2015 at the age of 72. He had spent more than 30 years working to bring Rosewood into the light. What I keep returning to after everything is the image of that road. Highway 24 in Levy County. The flat interior of Florida, the scrub pine pressing in from both sides. The place where a town was. The ground that remembers in the way ground remembers things not in words, not in markers, but in the particular quality of its silence. A community of 200 people built something there. They owned land and played music and taught their children and buried their dead. Then the mob came and the fires came and the silence came, and for 60 years the world drove past without knowing what had happened. What we owe a place like that is not nothing. What we owe it is exactly what it took 71 years to arrive: the acknowledgement that it existed, that it mattered, that what was done to it was a crime for which no one was ever held to account, and that the failure to hold anyone to account was itself a choice made by the state of Florida, by the federal government, by every institution that processed the information about Rosewood in January 1923 and decided that what happened there was the kind of thing that happened and did not require an answer. The marker is there now. The name is on the map again. It is not enough. It is also not nothing. Minnie Lee Langley knew the difference.